albedo effect, the Paris Agreement, and climate change. So, what is the science behind it all? Climate change has been linked to many human activities through research. Humans have, since the Industrial Revolution, been emitting more and more greenhouse gases in the form of, for example, carbon dioxide and methane. Greenhouse gases are a huge cause of climate change. So the Earth gets hit with sun rays and it will reflect back infrared radiation to try and cool itself off. However, when there are greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, for example, carbon dioxide, those molecules will be in the atmosphere and they will absorb those infrared radiation photons and they will move up a vibrational level. When they absorb that photon, they want to re-emit it. And when they re-emit it, they can re-emit that photon back towards the Earth and interfere with its cooling effect. So as you can see, as more and more greenhouse gases are emitted and there's more and more of those in the atmosphere, the Earth cannot cool itself off as well as it might be able to if they were not there. From 1880 to 2012, the global average temperature of the world has increased 0.85 degrees Celsius. Here's a graph. As you can see from what we have been able to find, these three greenhouse gases were relatively stable, and then this is right around the time of the Industrial Revolution when we started mass producing these greenhouse gases and burning many, many fossil fuels. These are some of the main contributors of greenhouse gases. Electricity and heat from homes and agricultural. The agricultural industry is two of the main contributors. This is just a graph showing that the average temperature has been rising in the fall from 1970 to 2012 from the United States. So that takes me to the albedo effect. What is it? It's a measurement of the amount of reflected sunlight off of any celestial object in the universe. It ranges from 0 to 1, 0 being a completely dark object, all the light that's being reflected onto the object, none is being reflected back off of it, and 1 being a 100% shiny object, all the light that is hitting it is being reflected back. The Earth has an albedo of about 0.31 to 0.367, depending on your sources, and the Moon is about 0.07. Saturn's moon, Enceladus, has the highest albedo of any celestial object that we have found in the universe, with an albedo of about 0.99. Forests have an albedo of about 0.07 to 0.15. Fresh snow has an albedo of about 0.6 to 0.9, and deserts have an albedo of about 0.3. Here's an infographic of how albedo works. So as you can see, sunlight is being reflected down onto the Earth. When it hits the snow, the majority is being reflected back, hence why it has such a high albedo. But when it hits the dark water, for example, it will, instead of being reflected back, the majority of it's being absorbed by the water. And even that little bit that is being reflected back, a lot of it can be directed back towards the Earth because of the clouds in the sky. And at any given time, about half the Earth is covered in clouds. So that is a big factor in light being re-emitted back towards the Earth. The same thing will happen to the land. Again, the snow is reflecting back the majority of the light that is hitting it, whereas the dark Earth is absorbing most of that light and taking it in and causing an increase in temperature. So the effects of it: an increase in Earth's temperature, because as more and more surface area of those dark objects like the water and the land are increasing, then more and more light is getting absorbed instead of reflected, and there's more and more heat energy heating up the Earth, so which will lead to a global temperature rise, and just continue in that cycle of climate change and continue to help it. So how this can affect you personally: more extreme weather, so there's more extreme wildfires, there's more extreme drought, a change in precipitation. So this is some stats showing from states in the United States of America how during their winter a lot of precipitation was falling as rain instead of snow. The coral reefs are also affected by this rise in temperature. They're very sensitive to their environment. So as that temperature of the oceans are rising, because more and more of it is absorbing more and more heat and more light as heat, the temperature of the oceans are rising and changing, for example, the pH. And so that is going to be affecting the coral reef. Another consequence of climate change and of a rise, lowering albedo would be a rise in sea level. For example, the Arctic sea ice has been decreasing in every successive decade since 1979. And from 1901 to 2012, the global sea level has risen 19 centimeters, and it is predicted that it will rise and it will increase 24 to 30 more centimeters by 2065, and another 40 to 63 centimeters by 2100, relative to the 1986 to 2005 levels. So as you can see, those rising sea levels will affect places where we live, for example. A final consequence of albedo and the rising temperatures of the earth is our yields of our crops. So our crops are very sensitive to, for example, insects. So the last characteristically hot day of summer and fall is getting later and later, which means the insects that affect our crops are out for longer and are alive for longer, which will have a detrimental impact on the yield of our crops. It has been estimated that for every increase in degrees Celsius, there will be a 10 to 25 decrease in the yield of corn, rice, and wheat crops. So now the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement involves countries. There's 180 of them to date that are coming together for a single goal. It entered into force on November 4th, 2016. Its goals is to keep the Earth's temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, ideally below 1.5 degrees. They want to encourage and support all countries to combat and adapt to climate change, and to accelerate and intensify the actions and investments for a sustainable low-carbon future. Canada is a very large contributor to the Paris Agreement. One of their main goals that they announced was they made a commitment to reduce their amount of carbon by 2030. So as of 2015, Canada was emitting about 725 approximately megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And their target by 2020 is 622, and their target by 2030 was about 524. As you can see, unfortunately, they are not on the projection right now to reach that goal, but there are still measures being taken to try to reduce it. Canada's long-term goal is to reduce their net emissions by 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. Here's another graph showing the measurements taken by the provinces specifically. So as you can see, if they did not implement any just the federal measures, we would be on track to be a lot higher of emissions. But because the provinces have put in their own, we are reducing a little bit. Our goals for the Copenhagen Accord target is 612 by 2020, as I said before. We are on track, however, to be making about 734, unfortunately. Now, our future, if everyone can come together, the human race can achieve the goals outlined by the Paris Agreement to start to combat the negative consequences of humanity's actions and strive for a better future for the future generations. Thank you for your time.